It's a major award! Merry Christmas, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and as promised, this morning we are taking a look at yet another Hollywood classic from the holidays that is set in the 1940s. And this is a film that hardly needs any introduction. I know many of you are watching it right now as we speak, and that is the 1983 Bob Clark film, A Christmas Story. This was a film that had modest box office returns, but much like It's a Wonderful Life, this is a film that found a very large audience once it started to be syndicated on television around the time of the holidays. And the rest, as they say, is history, and here we are. There are many videos and reactions and observations on YouTube about this beloved Hollywood classic, but not too many of them look at the film through a historical lens. And so rather than, merely kind of giving cinematic or narrative observations as we go through the movie, what I'm going to try to do is to offer you the historical background. What was it like to grow up in Indiana in the 1940s? What was it like to be a kid growing up at the tail end of the Great Depression? And surprisingly enough, this movie does a pretty good job of exploring some of those big historical themes. And that is what we are going to be taking a look at on this Christmas Day. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start to analyze A Christmas Story.
Downtown Holman was prepared for its yearly bacchanalia of peace on earth and goodwill to men.
A very purposeful opening shot that we see here. We see a factory or plants here in the background, and it almost immediately sets the scene for us because we know that the film is set in the industrial heartland, and indeed the movie is set in the fictional community of Holman, Indiana, which is a play on the name of the town where the story's creator, Gene Shepard, grew up, and that was Hammond, Indiana, not too far away from Chicago. For many of the exterior shots here, though, that we see at the outset, these were actually filmed in downtown Cleveland, Ohio, because many of the Art Deco buildings still had that ambience that was very representative of public spaces in the 1930s and the 1940s. These scenes were filmed around 3 in the morning in Cleveland on a cold winter's night. And this was done for a number of reasons. One, it was the least busy time for actual traffic to be going through. And furthermore, a lot of the more modern skyscrapers in the downtown area were concealed and had their lights turned off at that late hour. And so all the modernity surrounding this public square, it vanished for a short time, and this turned out to be prime filming hours.
Higbee's corner window was traditionally a high water mark of the pre-Christmas season.
Higbee's was a major department store chain in the greater Cleveland area and throughout the Midwest. That got started in 1860 as a dry goods store, and as this scene would suggest, it was a top-notch place to go shopping around the holiday season. And it remained open until 1992. Unfortunately, it closed its doors a mere 9 years after this movie was released. But fortunately, today, the building still stands in Cleveland, and it has been converted into a casino. But if you go there around the Christmas season, you can still find a kind of modern mock-up of these Christmas window displays paying homage to this movie.
First nighters, packed earmuff to earmuff, jostled in wonderment before a golden, tinkling
One of the other things that we can see here in the storefront display at Higbee's is that we see a number of people in Army uniforms. And this has led some viewers to believe that this movie is set during World War II. But I can absolutely guarantee you that this movie is not set during America's involvement in the Second World War, because if it was, there would be talk about the war. It would be on the radio. Ralphie would have been participating in scrap drives. There would have been recruitment posters and recruitment stations up in the department store. Simply put, this movie is not set during America's involvement in the Second World War. You may be wondering, though, then why are there people in World War II uniforms wandering about in these public spaces? And I can tell you exactly why. Once again, this movie is set in December of 1940. 2 months prior to this movie's beginning is when selective service started in the United States, America's first peacetime draft. And indeed, some of the first people who were drafted into military service would have been getting Christmas leave around this time. And so undoubtedly, some of the people who we see in Army uniform, those very distinctive mustard green, drab wool uniforms, are undoubtedly people who are home on Christmas leave. Perhaps they were, conscripted just 2 or 3 months earlier. And so that is some of my speculation, but it's a good material culture observation because, once more, it kind of puts this movie into a time capsule and gives us an understanding that, yes, this is something that took place a long time ago.
There it is. The holy grail of Christmas gifts, the Red Ryder 200-shot range model air rifle.
Red Ryder was much, much more than an air rifle. In fact, it was a very popular comic strip among young people from about 1930 to about 1965 is how long it was in print. And like so many comic strips of that time, as we will also see later in the film, it was just kind of a promotional gold mine where, you have product placement, kind of a merchandising empire that was associated with it. But unfortunately, believe it or not, the configuration of the sort of air rifle that Ralphie desires throughout the film never really existed in the state as he describes, with the compass and the stock and, all sorts of stuff like that. But these sorts of BB guns were very popular among young people at the time. And the Red Ryder rifle was produced by Daisy Outdoor Products. And the one similar as to what Ralphie desires came out in the spring of 1940. And this is one of many things that allows us to timestamp when this movie occurs. And this is a point of debate and conjecture among some of the most avid fans of this film. And the big question is, when does it take place? Is it 1938? Is it 1941? But there are a number of hints and indeed, kind of Easter eggs throughout the film that allows us to determine when this is. And that is the first of them, that this toy rifle came out in the spring of 1940, and a lot of people, young people, would have been desiring it as a Christmas gift.
They traded Bullfrog. I don't believe it. For Christ's sake, the Sox traded Bullfrog, the only player they got for Schottenhaufen.
The reference to the player Bullfrog here, that was the nickname for a Chicago White Sox pitcher by the name of Bill Diedrich. And Diedrich had suffered a number of injuries throughout his career that some fans prognosticated would be the death knell of his career. But in reality, he was not traded from the White Sox until 1946. And so the movie does play loose sometimes with some of the chronology. And undoubtedly that is because so many of the stories by Gene Shepard upon which this movie is based, things become an amalgamation and they become stitched together, and they're more so meant to capture the themes and the flavor of the era rather than present us a distinctive, comprehensive historical timeline of that decade.
Meanwhile, I struggled for exactly the right BB gun hit. It had to be firm, but subtle.
Flex says he saw some grizzly bears near Pulaski's candy store.
It's a rather fascinating thing when you think about the narrative structure of the film, because just a few years after this movie comes out, there's a very successful TV show that replicates this sort of model, and that is the TV show The Wonder Years, where you have an older version of the key protagonist who is reminiscing about his youth. And indeed, that was the sort of audience that this movie was going after. And when you think about movies that were made in the 1970s and the 1980s, there are a number of really distinctive ones that do this sort of reminiscing about the golden age of radio in the 1930s and the 1940s. There's the summer of 42, there's Radio Days, there's the Purple Rose of Cairo, and then there's movies like A Christmas Story. And in essence, what you have here is that you have, now grown adults who might be in their 50s, and they are seeking that degree of nostalgia, looking back on their youth. That's just what we see here in a lot of these films, and certainly A Christmas Story fits within that trend. This imagining of the showdown with Black Bart and his gang very much plays out like a 1940s serial that would play out in theaters of the time. And these were often, 25-minute shorts that would play before a main feature, and they were created in the effort to get moviegoers to come back to the theater every week. And, they would always, conclude, with, what will happen next week? Come back and see what young Ralphie, will encounter with, the gang of Black Bart next time, things of that nature. And those sorts of programs worked wonders in filling theaters, especially during the era of the Great Depression.
That hot damn Olds is froze up again.
Some men are Baptists, others Catholics. My father was an Oldsmobile man.
And I love the quotations here about the Oldsmobile. And in researching this film, I dug deep into the newspaper archives to see what newspapers were saying about these various issues and these various products in 1940 Indiana. And the car that the Parker family has in this movie is a 1938 Oldsmobile, and it was actually a touring sedan. And I was able to find an old kind of infomercial sort of advertisement about this car. And it's quite telling in what it says and how it phrases the situation.
In the heat of battle, my father wove a tapestry of obscenity that, as far as we know, is still hanging in space over Lake Michigan.
A tapestry of obscenity, indeed. And the idea, or all the work and machinery behind heating one's house in a place like Indiana in the 1940s is something else that kind of triggered my interest. Like, how did these things even work? A lot of people viewing this today might be like, well, what exactly is the mom doing? Why exactly is the furnace smoking? And indeed, in 1940, this was very much a period of transition in which a lot of households were making, this kind of move from your typical old school coal-operated furnace to things more so associated with gas and electricity that were considered cleaner and more efficient. A lot of things stand out in my mind in these opening schoolhouse and classroom scenes. First of all, just a fantastic job that the scouting teams and the production crews did in finding these locations that are representative of public buildings and spaces from the 1920s and the 1930s. I mean, Cleveland was a perfect place to make this movie. And in my mind, you know, Cleveland is a very sort of distinctive space because it has so many of these classical Art Deco buildings that were so typical of these Midwestern towns during this time, and a lot of them were still standing in the 1980s and still stand to this very day. And so, you know, just a great job on the part of the filmmakers in seeking these places out. The second thing that stands out to me is the fact that Ralphie's classroom is integrated. And indeed, you know, this movie isn't set in the Deep South where, you know, the color line was as, you know, as harshly, you know, enforced. But all that said, generally speaking, white and black students just didn't really go together in the classroom. They were often segregated by neighborhood. Now, in 1949, civil rights advocates successfully pushed for desegregation in Indiana schools, but it was, and in some ways continues to be, a long uphill struggle. The short of the matter, though, is that Ralphie's classroom is far more integrated in the film than what it would have been in 1940s Indiana, and dare I say, even Indiana today.
Well, go on, smartass, and do it. I'm going.
Flick's spine stiffened, his lips curled in a defiant sneer.
Something else interesting to think about, and I often think about this about a number of movies set during historical time periods. What if Flick or Schwartz would have been African-American characters? It really could have added to kind of the complexity, the nuance, and some of the really big themes of 1940s America. You know, what if, you know, if that had been the case, if Flick or Schwartz would have been treated differently than the other kids because of the color of their skin? And indeed, you know, I just think it would have added, you know, a lot of complexity that was very symbolic of the time. So, an interesting hypothetical in my mind, at least.
Where's Flick?
As a side production note, people have often wondered, you know, did they really stick this kid's tongue to the flagpole? You know, it looks like it's stuck, you know, for sure. And what they actually did is that they stuck an air tube in a hollow flagpole, and it was the suction from that tube through a hole that allowed this young actor to make it look like his tongue was stuck to the flagpole. So fear not, young Flick was not actually harmed in the making of this feature film.
Scut Farkas staring out at us with his yellow eyes. He had yellow eyes, so help me God, yellow eyes.
And of course, I suspect that everybody has known the likes of Scut Farkas in their lifetime, but this is a good moment to address some historical anachronisms that we see in the film. And to start off is the hat that Scut Farkas is wearing. This sort of headwear would commonly become known as the Davy Crockett cap. And here, the movie is about 15 years ahead of its time because these sorts of caps did not become common until the mid-1950s, thanks in large part to Walt Disney's songs, TV shows, movies, and merchandise. in which those became really popular hats for American youth. And so had Scott Farkas actually worn one of these in 1940, I think he would have gotten a lot of really strange looks from passersby, because they would have been kind of oblivious as to what was he really wearing. Of course, they were, believed to have been worn during, the colonial times and the age of explorers, but it would have been really hard to actually get one of those in 1940 unless Scott went out and picked up roadkill and made up one of his own. But who knows? He very well could have done that here. And there's a bunch of little like nitpicky things throughout the film as well. Ralphie's eyeglasses, more typical of eyewear from the 1970s and the 1980s. Kids more so would have worn thinner wire rim glasses, which was more customary for the 1930s, the 1940s. Farkas's braces, kind of more modern of the making of the time period of the film. So there's all of these little things, but it really doesn't matter. This is just historical nitpicking on my part in regard to the material culture.
I won! Look at that! Look at a Western Union telegram. Tonight is coming tonight. Huh?
And I'll just say here, as we're talking about a major award, how wonderfully acted the role of the old man is played by Darren McGavin. Darren McGavin was by and large a character actor. He had been making big screen appearances since the 1950s. He had acted with the likes of Gary Cooper and some of the best-known Hollywood personalities of the era that is actually depicted here in this film. But he was not the first or ideal choice to actually play the role of the old man. What director Bob Clark wanted most was for Jack Nicholson to play the old man. And so, it's really interesting to think about this sort of hypothetical. What sort of movie would this have been had Jack Nicholson played the father? Would it have had more celebrity upon its release? It's a wild thing to think about, but I think everybody can absolutely say with the utmost certainty that Darren McGavin was the right man for the job.
Oh, can I please have some more?
My mother had not had a hot meal for herself in 15 years.
This line about not getting a hot meal for the mother is an oft-repeated line among my family dinner table. You just can't stay ahead of the supply and demand aspect of it.
Show me how the piggies eat. Be a good boy. Show Mommy how the piggies eat.
The other more subliminal aspect of thinking about getting your kids to eat around the dinner table took on heightened importance during the era of the Great Depression. Because, the Parkers have a comfortable middle-class existence here. There were a lot of Americans, though, who were not faring as well as what they were. And so, there's this strong belief that, your good fortune, the hard work of your family has afforded you a good meal here on the dinner table, and by God, you are going to eat your food, especially when you consider the plight of so many of our fellow citizens. And so this is not out of the stretch of the imagination that, that there are demands being placed upon children to eat their food or else.
Right! Okay, bring right on in, fellas. That's it. There we go. A little more. That's it.
As the crate, famously marked fragile, is wheeled into the house, this is a great moment to reflect upon the point that this was a real house. It was in a neighborhood in Cleveland. And today, you can visit it as a Christmas Story museum, a Christmas Story historic landmark, if you will. And these scenes that we see here were among the few that were actually filmed in the interior of the house. A lot of the interior of the house was replicated on a soundstage just so the cameras could have a wider range of movement. But this moment when the crate is rolled into the house, was actually filmed at the real house in Cleveland. And it was purchased in the early 2000s off eBay. The owner bought it for something like $150,000, put another $500,000 into it. And today, it's one of the top tourist stops in the city, you know. In my mind, like, this was better than the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which isn't located too far away. My family and I have visited there. If you're a fan of this movie, that is a place where you absolutely have to go and make a stop.
Turn off all the lights. I want to see what it looks like from the street.
I'll go get the dining.
Couldn't we talk this over?
So, of course, the iconic image of the leg lamp, as we can see on my t-shirt and this half-scale reproduction that are widely available everywhere and are now in many, front windows throughout America. This definitely would have been considered an oddity in 1940s America. And indeed, many more traditional Americans would have considered it to be downright vulgar. Showing off so blatant a symbol as what Ralphie calls it, electric sex, gleaming in the window. And considering the kind of more old school values that a lot of parents had in 1940s America, it's not at all surprising to consider the fact that Ma Parker does not like the presence of this in her front window at all. And this sets the stage for one of the film's cultural battles that will play out in the scenes to come.
Move it a little bit to the right. Yeah, a little that way. Just a little more to the...
Due credit is also due to Melinda Dillon, who just wonderfully plays the mom. And yeah, she had come off of a number of really big hits in the 1970s, perhaps most notably Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And she gained a reputation in a lot of her films for playing this loving mother type. And certainly here too, this was a sign of good casting for this movie.
Poop, but it's a major award. I won it. Damn hell, you say you won it? Yeah. Mind power, Swede, mind power.
A fun little bit from this street side scene is that the character of Swede, who is wearing the fireman jacket, is actually director Bob Clark, who at first really struggled to have this movie made. And he had to, prior to this, make a kind of raunchy teen sex comedy called Porky's. And that was the agreement, that he had to make this teen comedy in order to make this more sentimental Christmas film. And boy, did that pay off in the long run. Sadly, though, Bob Clark and his daughter were killed in a head-on car crash in 2007 by someone whose blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit. And so, unfortunately, a really interesting filmmaker who was claimed long before his time should have been up.
You call this a paragraph? Margins, margins, margins.
The part about margins is a teacher's one that really strikes close to me. Students, they try for 2-inch margins sometimes, and I always tell them, I can see that a mile away. I've read thousands of papers. What are you trying to do? Oh my! So I can definitely empathize with Miss Shields in some of these circumstances of grading papers.
Is there something you want, Ralph?
I'm just turning in my theme.
Well, you can take your seat now.
And here, when you consider the plight of Miss Shields, just a hat off to all the teachers out there for putting up with the shenanigans and the daydreaming and the misadventures of all the young people who are entrusted to your care. Hats off to all of you.
The epic struggle which followed lives in the folklore of Cleveland Street to this very day.
Don't want to waste electricity.
Don't want to waste electricity.
Yes, don't want to waste electricity, but all of the upstairs lights are on.
entire Midwest.
These Christmas tree scenes were actually filmed in Toronto, if memory serves correctly. And so there were portions of this film that were actually shot in Canada because they definitely wanted kind of that cold ambience. They wanted the steam coming out of people's mouths and noses as they were in these outdoor environments. And I also believe that the passing of some of the vintage streetcars in the background, where places like this still had those sorts of amenities operating, may have been another draw for filming in this location.
My old man's spare tires were actually only tires in the academic sense. They were round, they had once been made of rubber.
Hey, was the old man really shrewd here when it came to his cars? I mean, after all, this car is only 2 years old. It's not like it's, you know, some sort of really, really cheap old clunker that he had skimped on.
No, not that way, not that way. Go on, come on, Rat Trap. Pull it like this, eh? How? Oh, like this. If I want to put the nuts in it. Okay.
But the 1938 Oldsmobile, it did not have lug nuts. It actually had wheel bolts. And so perhaps the old man doesn't know his car as best as he thought he did.
There you go.
Oh, for one brief moment, I saw all the bolts silhouetted against the lights of the traffic, and then they were gone.
And older Ralphie, in hindsight, he corrects, perhaps unknowingly, his father's misstep in proper terminology, saying the bolts, you know, flew into the night.
Oh, fudge.
Only I didn't say fudge.
You know, I really think it's kind of harsh on the old man to be an informant on his son here, because as Ralphie's walking away, you see the old man smirking, like, you know, like, oh yeah, like it was going to happen sooner or later, where he ends up saying this. And, you know, like, why wouldn't he just like keep it between he and his son? You know, if he obviously found that it was amusing, kind of a not so nice thing to do on the dad's part.
Schwartz!
Oh, I see.
We'll point out here that Peter Billingsley, the actor playing Ralphie, did not actually have to have soap in his mouth. He had a wax molding of one of these bars of soap in his mouth. And so, you know, calm down. He didn't actually have to go through the misery of all that. But Ralphie mentions the brand of soap, and it was Lifebuoy soap, which started up in 1895 and was one of the more popular and heavily used soaps by American consumers up through the 1950s. It is still made today, but it doesn't have quite as large an influence in the consumer marketplace in the United States as it did in the 1940s.
He heard it from your son.
As Mrs. Schwartz blows up on the line here, it's interesting to make reference to the telephone that is on the second story of the Parker household, because by the time we get into the 1940s, this was an era in which more and more Americans started to have phones in the upper story of their houses. Previously, you know, as we see at George Bailey's household in It's a Wonderful Life, which is set just 5 years after this movie, if the phone rang in the middle of the night, you would have to go downstairs to pick it up, which became quite a chore if you were in bed when the phone rang. And so telephones had become cheaper, they had become easier to operate and install by 1940, and as a result, that's why we see the likes of this phone showing up here at the top of the Parker stairs in their house.
Thank you, Heather.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you, Flip.
Thank you.
One of the repetitive gifts that shows up is fruit. And, you know, I think a lot of students and teachers today would be like, fruit? Like, why would you give fruit? But in the 1930s and the 1940s, fruit was really a delicacy. And that is what would often show up as stocking stuffers. And it's also likewise important to keep in mind that these were just simpler times. Children were not inundated with toys. And one reason why that was so is because a lot of families just simply couldn't afford it. And I've read some firsthand accounts from the 1930s and the 1940s where kids were just immensely happy to get crayons, a coloring book, socks, and fruit in their stockings. Those were the four things. And, you know, by our standards today, all that stuff only costs a few bucks, but it meant the world to kids of this time period because they grew up in an era of want where they couldn't take for granted what we do today. And so I think that's something really important to think about when we consider the gifts that people gave each other during this time.
Be it known to all and sundry that Ralph Parker is hereby appointed a member of the Little Orphan Annie Secret Circle and is entitled to all the honors and benefits occurring thereto.
As we see Ralphie getting his membership letter for the Little Orphan Annie Society, memberships like this were very much a staple for popular radio broadcasts of this era. And it really was all tied in with merchandising and product placement and building a sense of community, really, you know, especially among young people. And in the days before the internet, having that sort of social network connected through written correspondence and radio programs was how kids often felt that they were part of something bigger, as artificial or superficial as it may have been.
Is the message 12, 11,
I am in my first secret meeting.
14, 11, 18.
Another one of Ralphie's heroes in the film, which ended up being in the deleted scenes, and it accounted for another dream sequence in the movie, was an encounter that he had with another radio and comic strip star by the name of Flash Gordon. And to my knowledge, these scenes have been lost to posterity, although there's some scripts and visuals that remain of it. But the funny thing is that Flash Gordon, if you look at the end credits in the film, the actor who played him is credited, even though his scenes were cut. And that's one of the few remnants that we have here in the film from that dream sequence.
3:25. That's a message from Annie herself. Remember, don't tell anyone.
The Little Orphan Annie radio program, it was, of course, a spin-off of the very popular comic strip. And the Little Orphan Annie program started in 1930, and it eventually ended up on the Blue Network, which was the predecessor to modern-day ABC. The show was on the airwaves from 1930 to 1942, and it's often credited as being one of the first really, really popular radio programs that was aimed at younger audiences. And it kind of sets the stage for, you know, things like the Howdy Doody Show in the 1950s, Sesame Street in the 1960s, but it sometimes lacked the educational value of subsequent shows. The show was only 15 minutes long, and generally speaking, 7 out of those 15 minutes would be dedicated to the advertising of Ovaltine. And so kids were just inundated with messages from Ovaltine as they were tuning in to this show. And I believe shredded wheat was also another product that was placed while watching this program. But contrary to what we see in this scene here, the secret messages imparted from Annie to the young audiences, they were never these commercials about Ovaltine. What they were is that they were hints or previews about the next show. And this was a means of getting these young audiences to repetitively tune in night after night. And so, contrary to this disappointing moment here for Ralphie, there were never any secret messages saying, be sure to drink your Ovaltine. But, you know, it certainly works here from a narrative perspective.
Yes, yes, yes.
Be sure to drink your Ovaltine. Ovaltine?
Ovaltine was a popular milk flavoring supplement of the time. And indeed, it was the sponsor of the little Orphan Annie program. And there's a lot that we can unpack here as Ralphie is trying to decode the secret message. And one of the other Easter eggs is that on the decoder is the year 1940. And so once again, here is another little nugget that allows us to see, you know, that this parts of this movie can be time-stamped. There is also a calendar in the kitchen which says December 1940. And so when you do your homework and you dig a little bit, you can figure out precisely when this movie is set.
Wiser.
Even as a kid, I always thought that that was kind of a gruesome continuity shot, going from the younger brother opening up the lid of the toilet to opening up this hodgepodge pot that is boiling on top of the stove. And of course, in the background, a lot of people may not notice, the mom's trying to keep a straight face, and it's just not happening. And even though she can't say it, she knows she has won.
You want to get my old man for Christmas? No, what? A roasted squirt. People come to smell it, it squirts them. I'm getting my old man a flirt gun. Oh, flirt gun?
When Schwartz was talking about the gift that he's gonna get his dad for Christmas, viewers might think that he says flint gun. But what he's actually saying is flit gun. What a flit gun actually is that it's actually an insecticide gun, an air-pumped one, which was a very common thing to have in your household in the 1930s and the 1940s.
Can't be.
C plus? C plus?
Yeah, my question is, like, what sort of teacher gives a grade school or a C plus in an opinion-based paper? Like, huh? Different times, I guess. Even in fairly simple scenes like this, there's just a lot of really great set dressing. Once again, you can see streetcars in the background. There's an old tin sign for Orange Crush. There's just great set decorating in a lot of these scenes. And after you've seen it dozens of times like I have, you kind of have the ability to look beyond the foreground and see what's happening in the background. There's some really interesting stuff. Specifically, the cars that we see here are the remnants of two Ford Model A's, which had a very long shelf life within the Ford empire. And so not at all surprising to see the remnants of those laying about, because there were certainly a lot of them.
Something had happened. A fuse blew, and I had gone out of my skull.
Yeah, the unusual thing that plays out here, it's one of these just kind of timeless, universal things of school life. For kids who are bullied, there just comes a breaking point where they snap. But so often is the case is that when students like Ralphie step up to defend themselves, it's often them who gets suspended, and it's not the bullies who repetitively do it. But this is not uncommon to see something like this, and the standards of like exacting justice back in the 1940s were different, because there was just kind of this unwritten rule that it was acceptable to resolve these things in the schoolyard after school, and may the best man win. And so certainly very, very different by today's standards.
Hi. What's the matter? What you crying for?
Daddy's gonna kill Ralphie.
That's the type of younger brother that you want, one who is profoundly concerned about your well-being in circumstances like this. So even though they fight and bicker a lot in the movie, like this, I love this scene because it really just shows how much the two brothers actually do care for each other.
I heard the car roar up the driveway, and a wave of terror broke over me. He'll know what I said, the awful things that I said.
It's easy to forget just how well Peter Billingsley acts in this movie. I mean, because he shows a very wide range of emotion in this film. It's really hard for a child actor to convincingly cry on cue, as we see here in this film. And so, you know, hats off to him for just pulling off this moment of terror, you know, in his bedroom as such. And we once again return to this beautiful public square outside Higbee's in downtown Cleveland. In the background of the parade scenes, we can actually see a very notable monument dedicated to the American Civil War veterans who were from this region. And that was dedicated on July 4th, 1894. And something like that would have been a staple of downtown life in environments the likes of which Ralphie would have been growing up in this time. So that's a really cool kind of tourist attraction to check out if you're ever in Cleveland as well. But we can really dissect a whole lot of the aspects of the parade scene. Not only do we return to the storefront displays, we see characters from The Wizard of Oz who are marching about. And The Wizard of Oz only came out the year prior to all of this, and so it had been a very fresh, popular movie. And one aspect where the film doesn't prevail as well in regard to its authenticity is that the extras in the background are very obviously wearing early 1980s clothing. Indeed, the film only had a $3 million budget, and you can't dress everybody who's showing up to be an extra. But there's some very blatant and obvious 1980s apparel that we see in the background and the foreground of some of these scenes.
Look over there. See, the line's not so long. You can go get in it. Now take Randy's hand and hold on to him, and we'll see you later, okay?
Yes.
By contrast, this recreated interior of Higbee's, I think, is somewhat magical in its appearance. The standard was really kind of upped here in contrast to the previous outdoor scenes. People are dressed the part, they look the part, and these scenes capture an ambience of these old hometown department stores that we will never see the likes of again. And if you came from a city of any moderate size or a metropolitan area of note, every city had a department store like Higbee's. You know, a 5 or 8 story building that had, you know, like 40 different departments where you could go to get everything. And before everything became Walmart corporatized, things were more organic and homegrown. These were, you know, little companies that were invested in the community, and there was that sort of very dynamic relationship as such. And I just love seeing scenes like this that capture those sorts of moments and environments, because much like, you know, certain aspects of passenger train travel, live radio theater, it's all just gone the way of the dodo, and we'll never see it again.
Just where do you think you're going?
Going up to see Santa.
The line ends here. It begins there.
Also in the line to see Santa is the narrator, Gene Shepard, upon whose works this movie is based. And he plays, you know, kind of the grouchy father who reprimands Ralphie and his brother for trying to cut lines. So undoubtedly, some of you may have recognized his voice, but perhaps maybe did not make that connection. But he does make a cameo in this film. And, you know, at times, though, Gene Shepard's presence on set was a point of frustration on the part of director Bob Clark, because Shepard was very protective of his stories, and he was giving his own insights and interpretations as to what the characters should be doing, thinking, and saying. And that often conflicted with the vision that Clark had. And so there was sometimes friction on set as a result.
I like the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
I like the Tin Man.
And one of the urban legends about this movie is that the kid with the goggles, it was actually not planned to be in the movie. It was just a kid roaming the store, and Bob Clark liked the look of the kid and decided to incorporate them into the film. This up-close handheld pan here, where Santa gets in the face of Ralphie, just kind of speaks to the awkwardness of these sorts of situations at your local mall.
Come on, kid. How about a nice football?
Football? Football? What's a football?
Football had a growing popularity in America in the 1940s. It would only gain more momentum in the subsequent years of the Second World War. But for all intents and purposes, America's national pastime in 1940 is still very much baseball. But given the prevalence, the popularity of football, especially in the Midwest where Ralphie is growing up, it shouldn't surprise us in the least that Santa would recommend a football for young Ralphie.
A can of cyanide.
And this is only a few years after the Hindenburg crashes in New Jersey. So Zeppelins and blimps were also in the public consciousness at this time.
Aunt Clara had for years labored under the delusion that I was not only perpetually 4 years old, but also a girl.
Don't be ashamed. I know that many of you watching have a replica of this pink bunny suit. Do not be ashamed. Wear it proudly.
I wonder what it could be. Well, only one way to find out, isn't there? Well, it's a blue ball.
Just to be clear, there weren't any colored bowling balls until the 1960s. They were all black during this time. And that's because it wasn't until they started putting polyester in the making of the balls that colorizing them in such a way was even possible.
Immediately, my feet began to sweat as those two fluffy little bunnies with the blue button eyes stared sappily up at me.
We actually looked into ordering a pink bunny suit for me to wear during the filming of this. But with holiday shipping backlogs as they are, unfortunately, it was not feasible on our schedule, on our timing. So my yellow leg lamp t-shirt will have to suffice for today. Sorry, folks.
You know, this wine's not bad. Well, it's not good either, but you want to sip?
No, you don't.
Although Ralphie wasn't able to drink any wine here in this scene, Peter Billingsley was actually chewing real tobacco during his showdown with Black Bart earlier in the film, to which it made him very dizzy. And so he didn't get any booze, but he did get some tobacco. So he gets 2 out of the 3 things that he wants most out of our alcohol, tobacco, and firearms trifecta here. There's another little bit of good material culture context here in the form of BB guns in the 1940s. And in the book, Don't You Know There's a War On, which looks at the home front in America during World War II by historian Edward Steers, there's a good anecdote in here because certainly demand for BB guns among young men in the 1940s only accelerated once the United States entered that conflict because everybody wanted to go play Army. Everybody wanted to go out and pretend to, shoot the Germans and the Japanese in their backyard. And this posed a conundrum for manufacturers of the toy because steel was being collected and it was being scrapped and it was being put toward the war effort. And so, this is what the author has to say about these BB guns. In a display of patriotism, the company called the wooden gun the Daisy Victory Model. Each toy gun had a special decal on the stock of an eagle holding a shield with the words Daisy Victory Model. Surrounding the emblem was a red, white, and blue ribbon with the words Keep 'em Shooting. Mothers were too ecstatic over Daisy's victory gun. There was no chance of shooting your eye out with this little baby unless you were incredibly clumsy. While the victory model paled in comparison to the Red Ryder BB gun, it would do at least for the duration of the war. After all, kids were willing to do their part in the struggle against fascism. By the time the Daisy victory gun reached the market, every kid who begged for a Red Ryder BB gun heard over and over, "Don't you know there's a war on?" And so had Ralphie asked for a Red Ryder the following Christmas, he may have perhaps gotten that victory model instead due to wartime shortages.
Well, you can wear the old ones with the crack in them until we get you some new ones.
Okay.
I had pulled it off.
I love this brief little moment here where he breaks the fourth wall, which is kind of a tip of the hat to the likes of Laurel and Hardy of the 1930s and 40s, who would often make these asides or winks to the audience. And so another kind of nice little acknowledgement of popular cinema of the time. The big historical question that lingers here as the Bumpus's hounds invade the sanctity of the Parker kitchen is, were the Bumpuses real? Was Jean Shepherd influenced by a real-life family as such? And so once again, I looked to the newspaper archives and I went to the newspaper of Hammond, Indiana in 1940, and in the search engine, I put in Bumpus. And lo and behold, there were dozens of families, hundreds of individuals who had the last name of Bumpus in Hammond, Indiana, where Jean Shepherd was growing up during this era. Now, unfortunately, I was unable to find any stories of, the Bumpus's dogs running wild or not maintaining their property or not keeping up with city ordinance or anything like that. But there were Bumpuses in Hammond, Indiana, and unlikely that was a name that Jean Shepherd was familiar with growing up and accordingly ended up in some of his short stories. So there you go. The Bumpuses are real, and I'm sure at least a few of them had some mischievous hound dogs running about. Going into this scene, none of the actors knew that the workers in the restaurant were going to be singing to them, and so their reaction is very much genuine here as we once again see Melinda Dillon trying to withhold her laughter. What I really enjoy about A Christmas Story, beyond its comedy, its dark humor, its universal themes about the holiday season, is that every single year it introduces a new generation of viewers to this bygone era of holiday tradition. We do not often think of A Christmas Story as a historical film in the truest sense. We think of it as a Christmas film. But it is such a telling snapshot of America on the eve of the Second World War, no less, about the do's and don'ts, the dynamics, the complexities, the trial and error, the comedy of families just doing what they do during the Christmas season. And so it's my hope that as you watch this on Christmas and future Christmases, that you look beyond the face value of the film and you take a look at it for the very unique historical document that it is. And so with that, we wish you all a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays with your family. reach out to a friend, a family member, a loved one. Make the most of the holiday season. And with that, we'll see you next time on Real History. Don't shoot your eye out. Scene.